Okay, so, well, thanks Aoki and Elvira, and thanks to the IPSA Foundation for allowing this meeting, and particularly to Sylvia, who has been so welcoming and organizing this meeting so well. And it's very nice to be we are kind of a family scattered around the globe, so all the time we have this meeting is a great chance to see family members like that all together in the same place. I would like to start, let's see how it works. Yes, so the idea, when I started to work on science, there was, and there is still, the idea that there are two types of learning, okay? There is the learning that you do in school, that you go through in school when you study the theorem of Pythagoras, or the Battle of Waterloo, or the history of China, where basically you are given concepts and ideas, and you form representation about the world, about the history, about mathematics, physics, etc. And this is called explicit or declarative learning, so the learning of concepts and ideas. And then there is the other form of would say people lower level learning, some people consider it. There's procedural learning, when you learn to play tennis or when you learn to do a motor task. And the idea is that there essentially you're learning sequences and procedure rather than forming concept, abstract concept, etc. Now this, I say, this has been the rule in the field for a long time, and what I think I've been participating to in the last few decades is a bit of a change of perspective, and in which we have started to push the idea of learning, of motor learning, really as a territory where you learn concepts. You learn what we call internal representation. So the purpose of motor learning is not simply to get good at a particular task or a particular sport, but it's basically a way through which we form what one can call an actionable knowledge about the world, about physics and dynamics as we practice things. So let me begin. I'm going to have only one movie basically here, and this is a young fellow who was suffering from a high-level spinal cord injury, and he is now, at least in the movies, is learning to control a device, a computer, by movements of the shoulders. These two orange things that he has on the shoulders are essentially controlling the cursor on the screen. And basically what's happening here is learning to play Pong. I think you have similar game in the brain-machine interface. John Donahue has been showing one with the cyberkinetic device, where you have somebody controlling a Pong game by thinking. Here this guy is not just thinking to move, but he's actually moving in a way that is very unusual, very, very different from the way you would control the game. And what we are trying to say here is that is basically, while he's controlling this device, Jonathan is his name, is actually forming a new representation of the space where the cursor, where the paddle moves. And that is what allows him to do more than one task, do more than one thing. And so this is somewhat the program that I will try to go through in my talk. And I have to start with the idea, when we say space, okay, what is space, okay? I think many scientists are somewhat used to the idea of space as abstract things where you can represent numbers like myographic activities or signals. But there is something which is the original idea of space, which is the stuff that is around you. And this original space, there is this quote of the intuitive notion of space is somewhat captured by this quote by Einstein as somewhat of a container of rigid objects. But let's say what I want to push here is the concept that the ordinary space is Euclidean. And the fact that ordinary space is Euclidean carries a lot of consequences that are not so evident in other types of spaces. So for instance, the fact that the distance between 2 points is a straight line, the Pythagoras theorem. What I would like to say is that Pythagoras theorem is like the length of a vector is the sum of the square of its components. It's a complex idea, if you want. But the fact is that what I am suggesting is that even a child that is learning to move, an infant or a small child, knows the Pythagoras theorems in some ways, which is not necessarily doesn't know to write it, but your brain knows it, and it knows exactly what it means. We just learned to write this statement, which is a different thing. And so the main thing of Pythagoras theorems, for example, is the ability to separate the concept of direction and extent, which comes from the fact that all directions are equivalent, and so on and so forth. So the hypothesis here, well, first observation is that the brain signals, the things that are in your brains, are not really following Euclidean rules, okay? So if you will be, to make an example, if you make a movement of the finger of about 10 centimeters in a certain direction, you have the representation of the movement being 10 centimeters, even if you do it from different points and in different directions. But if you look at the motor signal in the brain or in the muscles, you are going to be hard challenged to find something which, say, 10 centimeters. Okay, that has this concept. So it's something that is very, very intuitive to us, very clear, but as neuroscientists, we really don't know exactly how these things are. It remains to a large extent a big mystery of science. One thing that I think we can sort of consider as an hypothesis is that this concept of Euclidean space is something that is not only something that we possess, but it's something that we are capable to update as we grow. For instance, as you grow, when you're a little child or when you're an adult, your size, your body motion, your body is completely changed, and yet you have still this ability of perceiving space in that way. So how do we study that? And so we started several years ago with a kind of a funky experiment where we were asking people, we put a cyber glove, which is a device that measures the movement of the fingers. So you get like 20 numbers coming out of this device when you move your hand. So you have 20 numbers here, and we make a very simple map between those 20 numbers and a cursor, a point on a screen. And we ask people to learn to control the movement of the point in the screen by moving their hand, which is a somewhat very difficult task. And the reason why we went into that task is that we were fascinated by this idea of these brain-machine interfaces, but we didn't want to spend the time implanting the brain and so on. And if you think about of a monkey or a human using a brain-machine interface to control a cursor on the screen, he's basically doing a similar operation, because it has to use activities that maybe are normally used to control the big toes or the tongue, and all of a sudden you have to use those motor activities to control a point on a screen. So it's a very, in a way, it's a very counterintuitive, but it reflects the ability of the motor system to learn. So when you give a task like that, of course, the first thing you want to know in a learning experiment, you want to know if somebody can learn the task. And the way to say whether you learn a task is to look at the error. And so you give a person to reach the task of reaching a set of targets, and you measure the error, the reaching errors, and this represents your ability to perform what you're supposed to do. And this is actually what we call learning in a way. But this is precisely what I say is not the most interesting part of learning. So the fact that humans, that we can learn to do what we are asked, is something that we can give almost for granted. What is interesting in a learning experiment is to look what happened on the side, what happens that we didn't ask the people to do. For instance, one thing that we don't ask in this task is to move straight to the target. So it doesn't really matter if you make a circle or if you go in different ways. But what happens is that people tend spontaneously to move in a rectilinear manner, and that already is a kind of a symptoms that they are learning a Euclidean property by virtue of the fact that they move on straighter and straighter lines. The other thing is that they learn is sort of to decompose. They learn to avoid wasting motion. They learn somewhat the structure of the map that we are giving to them, because they learn that some movements are not resulting in the motion of the cursor, and so they are sort of, we call them null space movement. They are movement that are not contributing to the movement of the cursor. And what we see is that through learning, those tend to decrease. And so the subjects tend to move more into a structure that resembles the planes they're working on. So these were sort of early evidence that people were learning structure from just practice. And then I had another student that made a small modification of the task indicated here. And basically, he asked the subject, to not control just a point, but they were controlling it's kind of a mechanism, like a double pendulum, like an arm. And so they have still to put the tip of the arm at certain targets, internal to certain targets. And it's a difficult task, which eventually these people learn. But here, Zach, the student, was able to ask a different question. That is, if it has two groups of subjects, one group were seeing the whole arm moving, and the other group were essentially controlling the same mechanism, but they were not told the mechanism. They were just showing the tip of the pointer moving around, and so they had to do the same thing, move the tip into the target. But so they are doing, in motor terms, they're doing exactly the same thing. But in perceptual terms, they have a different feedback. One sees the whole thing moving, and the other sees just a point moving. So what are the consequences on what people are learning in this case? Well, the consequence, if you take, these are the trajectory of the different subjects in the two groups. If you partition the trajectories by group, you see a very interesting separation. Here are the subjects that had only the entire vision of the arm as they were learning, and here is the subject that only saw the end point. And you immediately see that they learn different things. They kind of learn different trajectories. In which way are they different? When you look and do the analysis, a little bit more sophisticated of the mechanism, you see this donut shape here. The donut shape is the topology of the mechanism. A roboticist would call it is the configuration space. And because it's an angular space, it has the shape of a donut, because the angles have a 360 degrees. So they're mapped onto circles. So these two circles on the donut represent the two angles of the two joints. So this is the topological structure that they are controlling. And those dashed lines here on this structure represent the geodesic line, that is the path of minimum distance between 2 points on this donut. And what you see is that the green trajectory is the trajectory of people that are seeing the entire arm, whereas the orange trajectory is the trajectory of people that are seeing only the end point. And what is evident that happens is that people that are seeing the entire arm are learning spontaneously, without nobody telling anything to them. They're learning to move along geodesics of this torus. So they are really learning structure from practice. And this is actually an important thing because it may support dynamics. So I have another very bright student, Ali Farshan-Sadegh, in my lab, and he wanted to look at the implication in a different case, the meaning of the trajectory the subject choose if they are given haptic information, if they are actually interacting not with a virtual object, but with a virtual object that can return forces to you. So basically, we have in the lab, we have robot devices that can apply forces to your hand as you move around. And it can simulate, using such device, it can simulate the mechanics of a two-linkage system, like the one that I was showing before. Here, so the experiment is different from what I showed in the previous experiment. Here you have a person that makes movement of the arm that are very well practiced, so it's nothing new, as complex as a new pattern of movement like moving the fingers. But now you're basically grasping the endpoint of a mechanism, and you have to transport this mechanism from point A to point B. And you consider different situations. So he has these three groups a group 1, we call, where the subjects are seeing the double pendulum that they were controlling, but were also feeling the reaction forces of a double pendulum. The group 2 is seeing a point mass. They don't see the double pendulum. They see like only the tip of the pendulum, and they're feeling the forces of a double pendulum. And then you have a group 3 that is doing the other way around. This is seeing the forces of a point mass, but not but they are seeing a double pendulum. So if you ask these people to learn what they do, what trajectory are they learning? So you consider two types of trajectory. These are the straight line movements that we have seen, for instance, people learning when they see a point mass. And here you have this curved path, are paths that he calculated that are paths of minimum kinetic energy, minimum energy of the mechanism. The mechanism has only kinetic energy. And so you see those paths are different. And what Ali found is that through practice, only the subjects that are given coherent information, that is haptic and visual, they eventually learn to move along the path of minimum kinetic energy. And this is a thing that I believe has some important implication, because this is what essentially those subjects are doing. They are deriving information about the dynamics of an object that they are manipulating through the endpoint. So it's a very complex thing if you think about it. And they're learning the way to transfer the minimum. So moving in minimum kinetic energy means to learn the minimum transfer, the minimum energy transfer to that object. And so they're somewhat learning to move from A to B while minimizing the energy transfer to the object. And so this is, in a way, is an extraordinary thing from the point of view of the computation that the brain is doing spontaneously. And whenever there is only visual or haptic information that are not consistent, what do people do? The people do straight line movements, which is the basic way you would move in space without any other assumption. Because what you know is that the space is Euclidean. So I think to me the significance of straight line movement is the fact that the space is Euclidean. In fact, what you think about the minimum kinetic energy, the minimum energy path for a rigid object, so if you hold a hammer or if you hold a sponge or a stone, the minimum energy transfer would be a straight line, because an isolated object doesn't have those strange curves. So you get these strange curves when you deal with the kinematics, which is particularly complicated, like a double pendulum. So these are really substantial things. And I think it's important to know these things when we deal learning with an interface. I would say that there is another aspect of learning that people have been paying attention a lot in the recent years, and is the statistical aspect of learning. That is, the fact is that engineers are thinking of noise as a nuisance. Is a four-letter word. I mean, if you are an engineer, you want to construct a device, you have to have low noise and high signal, so high signal to noise ratio. In biology, things are a little bit complicated, apparently, because if you look at the biological signal, for instance, to the muscles, you see that the highest is the activity of the force that the muscle is generating, or the EMG activity on the muscle. Also, the highest is the variance, the variability. And so you have what they call signal-dependent noise. So the noise is not an independent thing, but depends on signal. So this has a lot of implication, it's theoretical implication, because a lot of models, engineering models, assume that the noise is not signal-dependent. So we have people like Emo Todorov and others that have been developing model of optimal feedback control based on the fact that you may deal with systems where the noise is signal dependent. And one of the things that are interesting in that is that there is evidence, and fairly convincing evidence, that the brain is capable when you can do an action in 10 different ways. Say you can make a movement of the hand in 10 different ways with 10 different angles, 10 different trajectories, and so on. There is a tendency to observe that the brain is choosing the pattern of commands that is minimizing the noise. So it seems that the brain is seeking minimum noise when making movement in many circumstances. So if that is the case, then I think this is something that is possible to exploit to actually guide learning. In other words, you can think of noise not just as a nuisance, but actually as an instrument that a therapist or somebody working with a robotic device can use to drive a patient toward a desired solution. So this is work, there are people that work in that sense. One of my students have been actually starting to do this work where your subjects are holding two inertial sensors. And each one of these inertial sensors is giving you two signals. Let's say give three, but it looks only, each one is a roll and a pitch signal. And so you have two numbers coming out of each of those sensors. So with the two hands, you have four numbers. And what it does, it maps those four numbers into a cursor, into a two-dimensional, the two coordinates of the cursor. So here you see that these are the deflection of the signals, and here you will see the two coordinates of the cursor. So you have a map where you can achieve the same cursor position in infinite ways. And what he basically wanted to test is what if you can decide a particular set of policy, you want to teach person to use certain postures to reach different positions. You can do this by encoding noise that would penalize your distance from the postures that you want to have. So how you do that? You basically you generate a jitter in your signal, and the jitter will be larger if you are in a posture different from the one that you want to achieve intuitively. And so what he found through this study on a group of healthy and impaired subjects is that, first of all, the noise does not really hurt the learning process too much. It's relatively benign. But the other thing he found that subjects here in red are control subjects that are not receiving noise, and in blue are subjects that receive noise. That's something I should have to say. So he has two groups of subjects. One group of subjects that learns the task without any noise, and the other that learns the task in the presence of noise. And the one in blue are the ones that are experiencing noise. And the one in blue, of course, have a reduction of the noise in time, and they also approach the desired policy. And most importantly, though, the subjects that have, when you compare how these two groups of subjects behave when they make a blind movement, so they give them a target and they make a movement, their task is to reach the target as accurate as possible, but without seeing the cursor as they move. What turns out is the subjects that have been exposed to this noise will eventually perform better than the subjects that have not been exposed to the noise. So one thing that we learned is that we can use this mechanism to possibly induce or try to teach subjects or patients to perform. I want to finish with a simple example here from our work. This is the same patient that we showed at the beginning, and he is engaging into driving a wheelchair. One of the purposes of this interface is controlling wheelchair by motions of the body. And what you see is that as he does this task, and he seems to enjoy it, then we also go from the virtual to the real wheelchair. But as he does this task, one thing that the clinicians tend to notice is that he's moving a lot the left shoulder and very little the right shoulder. And this is kind of a symmetry that you see often in spinal cord injured subjects. So the question is, you have a device that is a communication device for talking to an interface, but the device is based on a mapping from the motion of the body to the controlled motion of the device. And what you may want to do is you can potentially alter this mapping so as to, in parallel, to use the device, you can actually in parallel try to obtain certain therapeutic goals. So Camilla Pierella, in studio, she just graduated in my lab, she has been implementing this approach by a very simple operation on the interface. That is, she has been changing the gains so that at a certain point, as the subject is learning, it makes more difficult to do the task by moving the left shoulder. So it's like giving more authority to the shoulder that's moving less. It's sort of a very simple manipulation of the map. And so here are the results. These are the movement at the very initial session. And in green and in red are somewhat the left and the right side component of their motion. So you see, the beginning is a big mess, and after some trial, the subject have reached a pretty good level of learning, which is indicated by these trajectories. But this, still, you see that most of the motion is in green. That is, basically, they're doing the task well, using the degrees of freedom of the device on their left shoulder. And at this point, Camilla makes life more difficult to these patients by giving more authority to the right shoulder and less to the left. And so they have a deterioration. The task is now done worse. And then he does it a second time, so really gets a low level of performance. And then the subject has to relearn. And at the end of learning, what you see is that the subject recovered the performance that they had here, but now you have a relatively equal distribution of the control from the two shoulders. So you can do this with different goals. One of the goals would be the symmetry. You can do this to increase the range of motion. This, in a way, is one of the benefits of using body signals instead of cortical signals, although there's somebody that suggests, and I think it's a possibility that also brain signal can be used in this way. But one can sort of break the barrier between doing therapy and doing assistance by packaging the two things into the same framework. So I think I can stop here because I got my 25 minutes, but the conclusions, I can leave them here, but that's what I had to say. Thank you.